Hello, this is Michael McCarthy. In this video we're going to take a look at using Phoenix to create some dust and fine debris coming off of this pillar, which is a Mass Effects pillar. You can see we have a bunch of fragments coming off when this sphere hits it, and what we want to have happen is some nice fluid dynamic smoke come off of this and some fine detail particles, and we're going to do that with Phoenix FD. So to get started, let's go up into the top view. Go to Create, Geometry, and from the drop down we're going to pick Phoenix FD and drag out a Phoenix simulator. I'm just going to scrub a little bit further here so we can see where the fragments are coming out. We'll drag that around the perimeter, and then we'll go back to our camera view so we can check out the height. In the Modify panel, let's go to the grid, and here we can adjust the grid size, make it a little bit thinner maybe, tuck it in so that it fits our camera shot fairly well. Of course we want to make our grid encompass the entire shot, but not too big so that we have to over simulate things that we don't need in the shot. Next thing we'll do is go to Create, Helpers, and from the drop down choose Phoenix FD. We're going to have to create our source. So let's look on Phoenix Source, drag that out there. We're going to emit or discharge from these fragments that we have here. I've created a quick selection set. You can see a bunch of these fragments will be the ones that we'll use, and let's add those to our source. So with the source selected, go to the Modify panel, and under emitter nodes we'll say Add. Under selection set here we can pick that selection set and say Pick. And all those emitter nodes, which there's quite a few of, will get added into our Phoenix source. So each one of those is going to emit fluids. Now let's make some adjustments in here. First off, we're going to want to adjust the discharge and animate that over time. We don't want it to start discharging at 0. So let's go to about frame, maybe frame 12 or 13. Turn on auto key. And we'll just scrub this up and down. We'll set it to 10 so that we create a key there. And then at frame 12, we'll set it to 0. We'll make sure that we delete the 0 key here that 3ds Max has made for us, so that we're 0 all the way up until 12, and then at 13 we're going to start discharging. Next we're going to take a look at what we're going to emit: temperature, smoke, and we're going to want to add in particles. Now for temperature, we're not really looking for flames, we're just looking for the smoke, so let's put that down quite a bit to just 10. And when we do that, let's make sure that we have auto key off. So I'm going to hit Control Z, turn off auto key, and drop that temperature to 10. Smoke we'll leave at 1, but we'll make sure that we have there. Let's check velocity so that we have that information. Let's also check particles. So this might be something new that you're not familiar with doing. We're going to check particles, and the value is 100. Because we have so many different emitter nodes, this value of 100 is actually going to give us quite a bit of particles, so we probably don't need to up this. Depending on if you just have one emitter node, you may want to increase this to 1,000 or even more, depending on what you see in your scene. As far as the source goes, that's pretty much all we need to do. We've added in our emitter nodes, we've set our discharge and animated it, we've set our temperature and smoke, and we've exported our velocity as well as particles. Next, let's go back to our source node. I'm just going to bring up Zookeeper so that I can easily select these things. And when I go over here, we're going to set some preview values so that they're a little bit more logical. The default preview for liquid or temperature is rather high. We're going to set that to 10 or 11, and we'll set the bottom value just to maybe 1. You can uncheck as fire. Smoke will be fine like this, and other is going to be our particle color. So that's something to kind of know there. So we'll just change that maybe to yellow for the moment so that we can kind of see it. Now we can do a quick simulation. Right click and go to Simulation and choose Start. Another thing we might want to set up here is, because we're actually not discharging until 12, we can set that simulation to start a little bit later. So you can see this goes through our object fragments. we get our smoke, we get our particles, we get our temperature. I'm going to click on stop here. And just for the future, I'm going to actually set the start frame to maybe 10. Let's go down and just look at the preview so that we can see these different pieces. If I uncheck other, you can see these are all the particles we made, and this is going to be crucial in getting our fine detail that we're looking for. If I uncheck that, you can see we have our liquid or temperature, which is really just there to give us our smoke. Okay, if we render this out, already set to using V-Ray. Have some pretty low anti-aliasing settings, but we can see all this smoke kind of coming and exploding from our fragments. So we might want to go in and just change some of the colors really quickly. Let's go down into rendering, colors and transparency. And from here, I actually might even just turn off our temperature. So we'll set that to disabled under fire. And under smoke color and opacity, we can make a couple changes. So I might change this smoke color to not be quite as dark, and maybe a little bit closer to a tan or something like that. And do a quick render here. Alright, so you can see what we got there. And it might be a little bit dense. So I'll just cancel this. We'll go into the smoke opacity, which is using simple smoke, which is right here, and that's the smoke factor. So you can adjust its opacity right here. So if I bring this down to maybe 0.1 and we render it out quickly, you'll see that we get much more transparent smoke. And this is actually what we're going to want to use a little bit later. For right now, if I was just using the smoke, I'd probably go in and increase this to maybe 0.3 or 0.35. But that's a quick way to adjust your opacity for the simple smoke. The next thing I want to do is deal with those particles that we made. So actually what I'm going to do is disable this smoke. Let's go in here and under smoke color, just choose disable, and then we won't actually get any of this rendering out for the moment. We're going to focus on those particles. In order to render the particles, we're going to go to Create, Geometry, under Phoenix FD, and choose Phoenix Foam. Now this is the particle renderer that allows you to create foam for beer and splashes for waves and other things like that. And it also allows you to render just the general particles. When we go over here to the Modify panel, you can see Add Particle System. We'll click on Add, and we'll choose the Phoenix FD source. It's going to ask you if you want to set it as a liquid. We're going to say no. And you can see all the different particle sources that come from those emitters. So we can just keep them selected and say OK. All of those particle sources will get added into the particle systems drop down here. At this point, let's go back really quickly and select our simulator. And in the simulator, let's go to preview and turn on those particles. And actually, I'll probably turn off the liquid and smoke for now, just so that we can see those particles. We can make them something that's a little easier for us to distinguish here. And if we're having a slowdown in the viewport because of all the particles in there, I'm not here. It's actually doing really pretty well. But if you are, you can always use the detail cell reduction. I'm also going to uncheck only if selected, which means that we'll get to see whether this is selected or not. We're going to get to see those particles, which is going to be helpful. And sometimes in that case, choosing a cell reduction can be helpful because it's always going to display. I'm also going to just hide those. Okay, let's go back to our Phoenix Foam and set up some of our parameters. By default, this is set to point mode, which is good, and we have some pretty basic parameters in there. Let's just render this out. Point mode is going to render like a point renderer. It's going to take all these little points and give you a transparent dot around it. So I'll just move my mouse in here so we can see some of the detail, and you can see a lot of that coming in. I'm going to cancel this, as I think I have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I'm going to set my color, and I'll just use the color picker and actually choose, one of these greens, light greens that are kind of in here from the inside. And I'm also going to bring the refractive index down. If you bring this down a little bit to, let's say, 1.3, then it's going to give us more transparent particles. We'll just zoom in on this area and we'll render again. And this here might be a little bit too transparent. Another thing that I want to kind of talk about is the fact that right now these little points are actually casting shadows, which produces a really nice effect for the volume that we're seeing. But for previews, it can be a little bit slow. So let's go in and right click on our object. We'll go to Object Properties for the Phoenix Foam. Let's check that we do not want to cast shadows and choose OK. This will give us a little faster feedback when we're rendering so we can get the general volume laid out. I'll bring this back up to maybe a 1.6 and we'll do another quick render. So now you can see this is going through much faster, which has given us a good preview of what's happening. And you can see, really that fine detail of these wisps of particles kind of coming in. This can add a lot of depth and fine detail to your scenes. Okay, so there we go. We can see these nice little fine particles coming off. They have a good color going for them. They add a good transparency, which is nice. And one thing we can add in here is some motion blur. So let's turn on motion blur for V-Ray, and we're going to see that we actually need to set something up in our source as well as our simulator. So let's go into the render settings. Under V-Ray, we'll choose camera, turn on motion blur, and do a quick render here. Now you can see this message come up, which is what I kind of expected, and it's saying there's no velocity channel present for the motion blur of the particles. And that's something that you need to do in our output. So I'm going to say don't show this again. We'll cancel this out and you'll see that we'll start to get motion blur for all of our pieces, but there won't be motion blur for the smoke. That may actually be something that's desirable in some instances, so that's certainly something to think about. In our case, maybe we want it for both, at which point we're going to go into our simulator and make sure that we simulate this. This is an important lesson to learn because had this simulation taken a really long time, that would be something that we need. So under output, we want to make sure that we output our velocity, and that way we can get that information to the renderer, which can perform its motion blur. So we'll do another simulation with this. Let's go back up to simulate. Click on start. And we can see our liquid and smoke as well if we want to. And we'll do a quick render. So now we should be able to see these particles actually get motion blur, which is really pretty nice. You can see we're using some pretty low sampling for anti-aliasing just so that we can get an idea of this. And this will actually add to the detail and the volume of your particle renders, because what happens with the motion blur is it is actually adding particles as these go along on their velocities. So you add a lot of detail when you do add some of that motion blur in. And you can see that in the little motion blur section. So let's just let this cruise through a little bit more so we can get an idea of what that motion blur will look like for these particles. Okay, I feel like that gives us a pretty good idea. When we go to the Phoenix Foam, you'll see at the bottom when we choose point, we have a point rollout, and this will set our motion blur steps. So a lower value is actually going to give you more particles and more detail, and the higher value will actually give you a little bit less. So if I bump this up to say 2 motion blur steps, then this will be a little bit, maybe not quite as smooth, but it'll probably also render a bit faster. So you can see that has a little bit more grain to it, which actually again may be desirable for these fine particles, and it's rendering considerably faster. Okay, one other thing I'd actually like to look at in the simulator is in our simulator we also have an option for where we can emit these particles from, and this guy actually has some different face IDs. So if I go to our source, you can see that down at the bottom we have a polygon ID that we can emit from, which would kind of be nice to use. To do that, all I have to do is make sure I have the right polygon IDs. I'm actually going to turn off motion blur for now. Okay, so you can see these fragments that come off have a different material and a different polygon ID on the inside, and that actually may be a better place for us to discharge from. So in this case, I'm just going to go in. It's actually, if I bring up the material editor, polygon ID 4. So I'm going to set that to 4, and I'll do a re-simulation. So we'll select our simulator and click Start. I'll just stop this right here. We'll go back to maybe frame 17. Well, we can see our particles as well as our smoke, and do a quick render. And that's looking pretty good there. One other option I did want to show, which is actually a new option of the nightly builds, is to increase this count, similar to how we do it with motion blur. So if I go to our Phoenix foam, and you'll see this little count multiplier. This is something that is in the nightly builds, and I can up this to something like 2, and this is actually going to randomly place additional points around without doing the motion blur, so it'll give us a bit more detail. You'll see this phase come up with a multiplying particle count in the render. So you can see how that gets a lot more detailed. Still renders really pretty fast as we go through. I think I'll make a few more tweaks, so I might make this a bit darker and set the index of refraction a little bit higher, because now we're going to bring in those shadows. So let's go back to our Phoenix foam, and under properties we're going to set cast shadows and re-render. Now you see this will take a bit longer to render, but in a lot of cases the end result is certainly worth it. You can see that we get a lot more volume out of these particles, and they're casting shadows on the other objects in the scene, which is very nice. You can see that can tend to really bring out some of these details and tendrils like that, which is a detail level we're looking for. Okay, so last but not least, let's go back in and add our actual smoke. We'll select our source, go down to rendering, color and transparency, and we'll bring back our smoke. Do a quick render. And right off the bat, I can see the fine details that the particles are adding to the smoke. The smoke is probably a bit too opaque at this point. I'll just kind of go out here in a less dense area and see. So what I'll likely do is just go into our opacity and bring that down some. So over here under simple smoke factor, bring that down to maybe a 0.2 and render again. So here we're certainly seeing a bit more of those detailed particles and a little less of that kind of global smoke. We'll probably tweak it a little bit more and do a final render with some tuned anti-aliasing properties. Here's a complete rendering with a little bit better sampling quality. You can see the fine detail particles blending in with the softer smoke, and that's the kind of effect that we're looking to get. With a fairly quick simulation, you can get this type of detail by using the particle option in Phoenix FD. I hope this helps you with your production scenes moving forward, where you need to get this type of fine smoke detail. Thank you very much.